Chris, Carl, and Dale. My joke's going to start. We always have this new set of experiences. Now it's all about Zoom troubleshooting. The new world is learning how to get here virtually. And what a crazy year we just had with 2020. So I'm honored to share the stage with you all, to have this very powerful conversation about this maker movement. And so I really appreciate taking the time here to kind of connect with everybody and just kind of share the thoughts. The idea was kind of, and I know nobody gets together right now, and I think that's changing, but for the moment, this is a great experience. This is the next best thing we could have. But I really appreciate the opportunity to have kind of an intimate conversation and get your thoughts about what happened to the maker movement, or what that is. So let me just quickly introduce everybody, and if you want to say something, but Chris Anderson, I think this whole group needs no introduction if you're in the maker world. People have done some amazing stuff. So really, Chris and Chris Anderson, appreciate it. Dale Doherty and Carl Bass, thank you guys for joining this conversation today for HardwareCon. Really excited and honored to share the stage with you. So I think that, kind of the first thought was, we're here and the world just went upside down, but there's been so much that has happened over the past, let's even just take it a decade, with what we have called the maker movement. And is that the right nomenclature? Is that what's really going on? And, Chris, you wrote a book about it. I remember I read it. I read it cover to cover, Makers. Dale, you invented the word. And, so I don't know, Chris, what are your thoughts? What's your, where you're at with this these days?
I thought we would be more advanced than we are today. And that's probably my fault for a very narrow definition of the makers. I feel like in a sense we lost the battle, but we won the war. Digital tools continued to get way better. People creative, YouTube is this amazing, place where creatives can inspire each other. Democratization of the tools of production continued apace. What didn't happen was some of the stuff that we put under the capital M makers, rubric, the notion of a 3D printer in every home, the notion of maker spaces in every school, open source hardware, things like Maker Faire, itself did not explode, past that sort of that level that we had in our minds in, a decade ago. And obviously we have lessons to be learned about this. And I think that, on the supply side, we did great. We definitely did. The tools are getting better and better. No problems there. On the demand side, I don't think we kind of completely figured out who are these capital M makers. What do they want? Are there industries to be created? Is this the future of manufacturing, or is it just a hobby? And that's the bit that either did not work out or has not yet worked out.
I think the changes are so subtle. It's amazing. 3D printers, I don't think they lived up to the hype cycle. And I think that's a big thing. We talk about hype cycle. You've coined the term long tail. But I feel like with 3D printers, it's hitting the mainstream. Everybody's seen one, right? But 10 years ago, not everybody saw one. They were like, wow, it's like the Star Trek thing. And I think that's where that hype cycle really took off. But I feel like the normalization that we're talking about, it's happening. It's in almost every school, every library, they got grants. And that's Dale has really promoted that idea of ubiquitous maker spaces. And you can't have a maker space without the 3D printer. So although we don't see a 3D printer in every home, and mainstream, I think, and a lot of folks just don't get it and aren't buying it, but it is pretty ubiquitous, whereas it was a rarity at some point. And those machines were $100,000 at one point, minimum.
I would love Dale's perspective. I said, well, I don't think it is in every school. I think that there are probably 3D printers gathering dust in some closet in most schools, but I don't think that functioning, viable maker spaces, with curriculums and teachers attached are in fact ubiquitous. Dale, what do you think?
Well, it's hard to know. It's actually been very difficult to know, even within a population like libraries that do surveys of their libraries. I think you kind of have to say there's certainly more than there ever were, in each year it does grow. We never, this is a grassroots bottom-up effort. So we never had this top-down, we're going to fund maker spaces in schools. It's never been accepted. I always said, making came in the side door, not the front door into schools. However, I just did a story on RIT, Rochester Institute of Technology, something like a 20 to $40 million building with, 4 floors of makerspace in it. Right. And when you kind of see that happening, it tends to affect the rest of the levels of education. But it certainly was never uniform. I always hoped it would be in education and not come with a curriculum, not come with a rigid prescriptive way of doing this, which is, I think, the key idea of the maker movement is people have projects. And how do we get more people to have projects? And kids could have projects if you gave them some time, and they had access to resources like materials and tools, and they had some mentorship or some other people to support them. Those are kind of the key ingredients. They don't have to be in school to work, but you certainly reach more people if you had them there. I don't think it's been a great business breakthrough. Silicon Valley certainly moved on to other things. Software still eats the world. Hardware is hard. All those things we've heard over the years. Yet, I run into people and who's turned their hobby into some kind of business. They were able to use a 3D printer to prototype the thing. But someone who was doing these kind of attachment for jars that fit into pegboards, and he still has to go talk to hardware stores that want to carry it, and it has to still sit on a shelf, and that's really hard, as opposed to saying I've got a website and anybody in the world can access it. So it's playing a different game completely, and I don't think it's well understood. I always use the example of thinking of the web. I mean, back in those days, you thought of organizations like Google and Yahoo and all that came into being. But there are also all these little web design firms, that do people that do website. There was never the firm or the company that did it. It was widely distributed and very localized. And so making looks a lot like that to me still. Is just, which I think is a really fabulous property of it, as we saw during right. COVID-19, that people could take designs and make them for face shields or other protective gear in their community and distribute to their local hospital. And if the local hospital wouldn't take them, they'd find a physician who'd walk them in and hand them out, indirectly. So I had to say, just to close on that, is in some ways I personally felt like the maker movement matured in COVID-19, in the sense that these are crazy ideas that have been floating around, maker spaces. Nobody really seems to know what they're good for, except some core group uses them. But people responded. They brought skills, they brought their imagination, they brought the creativity, and they brought a level of social concern to solving these problems that I think in many cases was extraordinary. And I call it Plan C because Plan A was the government responding to COVID-19. Plan B was industry responding. None of them did a very good job, and so Plan C was more a civic response. And so I think that's I hold out hope that that's a model that you can skill people, give people new skills, new tools, and they can do more things themselves that matter.
Yeah, I think there's this interesting dichotomy between maybe calling a culture or subculture and a commercialization, And I remember, Chris, you made a profound, I remember this was many years ago, talk because you're in the punk scenes and said DIY punk, and that's very maker-esque. And so it's like, I never correlated those two. And I thought that's really interesting because I could see maker is definitely a subculture. There are people who just want to make and they wake up to make. I love making, but I love making something with a project. So I like the curriculum. I want something to sink my teeth in. And I think, there was the hype cycle was this commercialization. We saw that with MakerBot. And I think that's clearly did not materialize. Because I also did the parallel 10 years ago. I was saying, this is like the personal computer movement. Personal computers, they were hobbyist toys. There was no good use for them. That's what the old pundits said in the 70s about personal computers. And then all of a sudden it became the spreadsheet, the killer business app. And then the PC industry just took off. So I think that, I think there's an interesting finer point. Are we talking about is the commercialization? And I also too think in terms of on the commercial side, it has changed in subtle ways. Like I see hardware startups using and buying their own little 3D printers, and now they're able to prototype, whereas 15 years ago they couldn't do that. Like you couldn't start a company, a hardware company with 50 grand or 100 grand. You just couldn't do that. But now I think it's there. So I come back to Bill Gates did a quote, and he said, people overestimate technology in the short term and underestimate it in the long term. And I think that's kind of interesting. And I think that that's kind of where I see a lot of technological innovations. There's that hype cycle. Everybody says it's going to change the world, and then it doesn't change tomorrow. But if you look 10 years from now or 5 years, it's certainly that there's a lot of significant radical changes going on.
I think we should make a distinction between capital M maker movement, which is, a high standard, it's a movement, people define themselves as makers, versus small m making. I think we've absolutely seen small m making, continue to progress and even in revolutionary ways. I just don't know whether people consider those entrepreneurs that you refer to, I don't know whether they still consider themselves part of the maker movement, right. Capital M, capital M.
Yeah, I think the first idea is, I don't think makers were ever a group as a whole. So I know why, as journalists or others, lump them together. Our affinities are actually most often with people who do things similar to we do. So if you build electronic circuits, you're really interested in others who do that. But what you miss out on is people are making every day, whether it's cooking, sewing, making electronics, building things, welding. But like the group I'm interested in is like right now I'm building electric vehicles. So I align myself with people like that. I'm not so interested in a 3D printer for the sake of it, or somebody who's sewing today. So I think the first distinction is that we probably looked at this on the wrong axis. And it was probably a useful axis at the time, but it is not what motivates the individuals. So the first one is having an idea and turning it into a thing. And we do that all the time. And I would argue that the tools we have to do that, whether they're digital tools, YouTube, are way more powerful than anything we had 10, 20, or when I started out doing this 40 years ago. The second thing is, I think there was also maybe unconscious effort to conflate these things. I think when you take personal, professional or entrepreneurial and educational, it was convenient to wrap them together, but there was never necessarily a natural association with them. So when I look and I go, in each of those categories, I can see where things have succeeded and failed. I just don't lump them together, because to me, that was never a convenient way of understanding what we were trying to accomplish.
Right. I think that's a really powerful point, that there was this big banner, makers, that way, like you said, they're so dynamic, they're so diverse. And I have to tell you, I think, got to give you props, Dale. The Maker Faire is to me, the most phenomenal. I've done conferences, events, one of the most phenomenal, interesting gatherings. How did you get corporate and kids and adults and just make it something for everyone, the whole family? It's really powerful. And I just think that's really a powerful thing that you created with the Maker Faire, to get that very broad cross section.
But I think, I was just going after something that's sort of human, that I think is not necessarily, before I called them makers, I call them enthusiasts, which we could go back and find the computer enthusiasts and all that. And, geek or whatever words we use, there is a level of interest that some people have in things. And it's really fascinating to connect to people. My simple idea around Maker Faire was just to meet people that do really different things and actually see that they have a lot in common. They all have projects, they have enthusiasm for what they're doing. It doesn't roll up necessarily, maybe in the way that Carl was talking about, into being, here's this or that. And we did luck into, bringing different parties together, but they were all their own communities in a way, and had their own, they going to thrive in that. But, there's something, it's sort of like saying, you have a food event and you bring ethnic foods and all these other things together, and they kind of see themselves on their own terms. But, for the public to sample all that in one place is kind of exciting and different.
Right. That's what made Maker Faire wonderful. And I loved Maker Faire. But on the, it's like your smorgasbord of ethnic foods, or you go music.
Right.
You could
Right.
bring opera and jazz and punk and classic rock together. Their identities aren't necessarily, I mean, it's only the unusual individual who says, I love all of these equally. They're
Sure.
most often much more aligned with a single thread of that or a couple threads of it than they are going across the whole, how many great bluegrass banjo players, were also opera singers. It's just not the way we're wired as humans. And so while I think it was convenient, to me, Maker Faire was, and I make things all the time. It was a little bit more like going to an art museum or a concert. It was interesting. It was provocative. It was educational. But like the people that I was interested in, I had my own ways of getting at online, Instagram. I mean, my connections with the people doing the things I'm most interested in weren't at the generic events.
Sure. The only thing I'd like to recover one idea there is,
Yeah.
Most people don't make things. I mean, the broader consumer culture is kind of not one of my goals. Was try to get people to see that these capabilities were available to them, and I really didn't care whether they express it this way or that way. To only care about it, it does Maker succeed or any is if it helps to identify people who choose to do something that's valuable to me.
But Dale, that's always been like the geek's conceit, the nerd's conceit, that it has to have like an Arduino in it or something. Well, and that's like, when we did like Instructables, I mean, we were very clear that the idea of making is having an idea in your head and then getting a physical artifact. And that's why we embrace things like cooking. So to say that people don't cook.
There are probably more people cook today than did 20 years ago and take it more seriously.
During the pandemic, everybody was an artistic bread maker or brewmaster.
I'll raise my hand. But that is a cultural thing, that people see that as something that's valuable to do. Right. And most people buy food, but don't necessarily view themselves as cooks.
But here's the thing that I think is a little nuanced difference, that in this, you're right, humans have been cooking since the dawn of human beings, right? But the new thing is now you could go online and find any recipe anywhere, get the best recipe from the best chefs. That was near impossible. Now it's the Instructables. I mean, you could learn how to build things. And so the maker movement really was this confluence. And I wanted to bring this up: digital tools, accessible tools, the internet, and then this collaboration. There wouldn't have been a movement, so to say, if it wasn't the internet in helping exchange ideas. And I mean, it's been pushing our technological revolution over the past 20 years for sure. I think that's kind of a pretty big difference, is that we've had these new tools that have now been available, and then maker spaces started coming where they were more accessible. And then, online platforms, like you said, Instructables, giving people a step-by-step and able to do it. So I think it encouraged it. I think there was this, and it still is, a very predominant consumer culture, right? A tastemaker says, this is what we're going to produce. We're going to commercialize it, commoditize it, put it on TV, put it on a commercial. Everybody buys it at the store. Well, that's kind of changing it up a little bit now. The internet's completely broken the TV model from a single, almost single, archaic, I don't know what you would call it, kind of organization, to extremely distributed content creators, right? It's kind of gone from a very hierarchical structure. Very few people control the content to almost everybody can start to control the content and the conversation. And it's really amazing how much we've shifted from that paradigm.
The other question I have for, Dale and Chris is, I mean, you guys seem to be very down on the commercialization or the entrepreneurial angle. But I look around and I go, I don't know, there's a dozen people making autonomous vehicles, a dozen companies making electric vehicles, a dozen companies making LiDAR, a dozen companies putting things into space. I mean, we could go on and on. Thousands of robotics companies doing robotic things that weren't done before. And you could say they would have existed without what you think of as the maker movement. To deny that that's going on and these companies are viable commercial entities seems to be.
Yeah. So I certainly am, not down on entrepreneurship and innovation, all this kind of stuff. No, there was a specific, and again, I'm slightly beating myself up over the particular path I described in Makers, which is basically the kind of Kickstarter to IPO, approach. These would be people who started super small Maker Faire ones and just built a community, grew, and then ultimately became a mass market consumer phenomenon. And there aren't very many of those. And I should say that my own company, 3DR, was exactly that. And by the time that we were economically significant, we were completely misaligned with the maker movement. We even gave up open source hardware. We gave up almost all the things that kind of got us there so that we could scale to the next level. My failure was in thinking there was a graceful continuum from Maker Faire to IPO, and the companies that we now, Carl, you rightly described, they certainly use some of the tools of the maker movement. They benefit from it, but I don't think that they kind of built themselves up from the same kind of grassroots community approach.
It was not a bootstrap, and so to the extent that any of us predicted that it was somewhat linear and that people could bootstrap, what I think the failure is that we might have missed is the capital requirements,
absolutely,
or the advantage that more capital gives you.
Well, let me give you two examples of that. Two particular failures. One is that I thought our big competitive advantage was going to be open source hardware and open source software. My joke was, hey, we can beat the Chinese because the only thing cheaper than a Chinese engineer is a free engineer. Turns out that when you get to a certain level of professionalism, you've got to pay your engineers, right? You got to, the open source people become employees, and otherwise they just don't do the kind of boring stuff that needs to be done. And open source hardware turned out to be a complete fiasco. Basically, as what we enabled was an army of Chinese cloners who undercut us on price, and very few people who actually, remixed our designs and made them better and out there. So I think consumers won because you got cheap goods, but the companies that created the open source hardware have by and large lost. And I think it's interesting the Arduino has essentially given up on open source hardware. It's very hard to think of anybody who's still doing it in the full sense of giving away your design file so that anyone can make it.
It's a powerful point. I want to bring that up about just open source in general. I've been a huge kind of proponent and advocate for it, watching it closely. Rewinding the clock when I was in IT many years ago, I remember going to conferences with Linux, right? Linux was so powerful. And then I always wondered why it didn't take over the desktop. It never touched the desktop. Microsoft always won in the desktop. Now Apple has won with the UI. But it's a hidden giant because the internet is largely run on all open source, 80% on the software side. Right? I mean, basically what has been told is Facebook, Google, Amazon, all those companies would not be able to exist the way they do and operate today if it wasn't for open source. They couldn't afford the Microsoft licensing fees. So, I understand, like, it's like open source has been this hidden warrior that's empowered the movement, but
don't confuse open source software with open source hardware.
Oh, I know.
Yeah, open source software is an extraordinary success. Nothing more needs to be said. Open source hardware, I think, has failed.
I agree with what you just said. It's really challenging, and I'm glad you brought up your company because you started with DIY drones that morphed into a commercial venture. So I mean, you're living that path and seeing those challenges head on. And to Carl's point, I think entrepreneurialism has always been there. It's kind of like, but where, how does that kind of translated, with, these companies and using open source technologies, the idea of collaborating. I don't know if it worked in software, why can't it work in hardware? I think that's what everybody said.
Because I thought a lot about this because, obviously I championed this and then just got, bit in the butt by it. The problem is that with software, there's a lot of people who can write software. So if you put out your code in Stack Overflow or whatever, everyone has the tools to be able to use it and modify it. With hardware in the early days, when it was like Arduinos and through hole soldering, et cetera, maybe anybody could do that. After we went past the 8-bit era to 32-bit, gigahertz boards, basically none of us had the skills to be able to remix a board anymore, unless you happen to be a Chinese, hardware company, in which case you were doing it to clone it, not to redonate it to the community. So I think basically hardware, just to your point, hardware got harder And therefore, the people who could usefully take the open source designs and then improve them and then give them back to the community shrank, so that there just weren't enough of them.
Sometimes, we debate licenses and all these other things in there, and that was one. But sort of the availability of cheap components and the ability to remix those components almost in Lego fashion, I think has been, continues to be very powerful. And I think in some ways, what we might have thought is, here's an entrepreneurial path. You kind of have this collaborative path that, I don't know, if you're solving a problem, but there's no business model for it, you might just share that design, or share just like you would share the instructions. This is how you build one of these yourself, and maybe you figure out that there's more people out there that care about it than before, which kind of was the original open source software. It's the populated niches. Many of those niches didn't grow, but some of them did, and so there are strategies within this that I think are not necessarily competing with business or replacing it, but if you want to get an idea out into the world, you have other strategies to follow that sharing enables. And when I was first doing Maker Faire, I get these frustrated inventors showing up and saying, why they weren't successful, that nobody wanted their idea and they couldn't get into the market. And I said, I ever thought of sharing it, just giving it away and seeing if it's such a good idea. And some of that happened. It didn't necessarily make money for people that way, but it may have been valuable in other regards.
I think that's,
Yeah, but if you look at open source software, so I have a different take on it, which was there were two kinds of open source software. There were the commoditized things, and I would put Unix, Linux, and all its variants in there. Very well understood pieces of technology where hundreds or thousands of people had already worked on the Unix kernel. And what they did is they came together and continued a history of people working in conjunction on it. So there's lots of things that were well understood pieces of technology. There's a number of the databases, the web servers, they were well understood and relatively easy to collaborate on. The question, to your unquestioned success of open software is, was there a lot of innovation in open source software? And I would say most of the success of open source software was cost sharing. As a matter of fact, at any one time you would look, and there were huge numbers of professional engineers being paid by large corporations to work on open source. And it was really that, for example, when we had 10 workstation companies, they all decided that Unix couldn't be their competitive differentiator. They were all selling the same 20-year-old operating system, which is now a 40-year-old operating system. But they could save money by not having to do it individually. I think you need to understand in the open source environments which things you can really move the ball forward, get new innovation, different ideas. And I would say in open source hardware or software, that's a little bit more limited set of things that you find that were really novel. Whereas the other one of, we all need the same thing, we don't want to waste a lot of time on it, whether that's personally or professionally, it's really easy to get everybody to join hands and do it.
right. I mean, it makes sense what you're saying. You can almost make the correlation about open source basically being when things come off patent and they become completely commoditized. Like that's the model. So it basically goes from closed source to open when the patents expire, which is kind of what started the 3D printer kind of, and so it's really interesting to kind of take a look at that. But I just think there's so much, like it's interesting because just bring it back to current events. We're talking about this vaccinations that were basically lightning speed to the market. If there wasn't collaboration, it really, I don't see how we could have ever done that. It's kind of, from what I understood, there was a lot of collaboration across companies, governments, people. Collaboration brings in a lot of things. And I think that was what we see with open source. That's what we see with, there was the maker movement, people kind of collaborating behind a common cause. I mean, do we think that this is just the beginning, or do we think it's really going to go back to silos and competitive advantages and trade secrets?
No, you're exactly right. I mean, but that the internet as a collaboration medium is the tool that matters most. And I always thought that despite the fact that I name all my communities DIY, In fact, it's not do it yourself, it's do it together. And the together being the key bit. So, I mean, I think, Carl or maybe Dale mentioned that, YouTube is a great catalyst and accelerator of innovation, because you can get inspiration and guidance, for absolutely, the long tail of everything out there. And that actually probably is more meaningful than all the 3D printers and Arduinos that we've ever invented.
Yeah, democratization of learning really is what that is, and all those things that used to need someone personally accessible is now possible just learn on YouTube.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think the real advantage there, if I think back, is that the hurdle used to be to transmit this knowledge. It had to be worthy of being a magazine article or a book. And somebody passed judgment on how many people want to learn how to weld or solder or build a canoe. And it often didn't, these ideas didn't cross that threshold. On YouTube, the barrier is almost nothing. I set up a camera behind me and I show you what I'm doing. And if you care, you watch it. And so, I mean, that is closer to the original promise of what we all thought about when the internet was started, that we would give the means of publication to all these people who really didn't have a voice and were limited by, whether it was the New York Times or National Geographic who said, this is good enough. And we really, YouTube really overcame that, and now all the others like Instagram, etc., that allow us to see all this work. And we no longer have the big time lag. I mean, I remember when I was first learning, I'd go to New York City public libraries, hope that one book was there, go to the shelves and look up, my Dewey Decimal System, and then find out that the only book on the subject I was interested in, it was published 20 years ago and most of the pages had been ripped out. We don't have that frustration anymore, and what we've really empowered is this just-in-time learning, which is, I decide today I want to do something, I look online and there's usually someone who's quite expert, who's, for whatever reason, willingly and freely given of their time and knowledge. And it really exploits this idea that, being good at something, being skilled, being knowledgeable is not zero sum. I can be, a good woodworker and you can be a good woodworker, and it doesn't detract from the other. So I think there's a number of things that have really been promoted, this just-in-time learning, which is just a completely different learning mode. And, as Eric started, if you look at the RITs and the Cal Polys and the Georgia Techs and ASUs, who really capitalize, there used to be different names for it, but it really is a fundamentally different way of learning things, in a hands-on creative problem solving way than, the more traditional book thing where you go get an engineering degree and after 4 years, you're allowed to touch a tool, and actually build something.
It's funny, the word that we, so although makers didn't take off, creators did. And I think what's really interesting about creators, what's the difference between a creator and a maker? And a creator has this word creative, it suggests there's a media element of it, an artistic element. And maybe it's that what we've learned is that making and then telling is really the key bit, the media skills that allow you to describe what you've done, get people excited about it, build communities around it. And so, creatives actually turned out to be the successful subgroup of makers.
Yeah, it's the medium, right? The media is the medium. The internet is that medium. I think it's so powerful, the knowledge and the sharing. Let's talk about the future. Where do we see this all going? I mean, it's exponential, and that's what's, in fact, the ability to learn just-in-time learning, as you said, the ability to radically advance ideas and have, basically an advancement could just be a thunderclap around the world. Where do we see this going? Where do we see the future in terms of both making it? It almost sounds like this is about learning. This is about the internet and tools, and it's about the communities that are supporting those efforts. Where do we see this all going?
One thing I would say is on the professional, entrepreneurial, commercial sense, I have never seen a time where there are more companies doing interesting things that are combining the use of, hardware and software. I mentioned a few, but you look at robotic agriculture, the number of people making nuclear reactors. I mean, the idea that we have DIY kind of nuclear reactors And there are literally dozens of companies doing this. And there has been an entire financial environment that's been created that now supports this, is radically different than 10 years ago or 20 years ago. The idea that people can literally raise hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars to put satellites in space or robots in factories is mind-boggling. And certainly many of these companies will fail, but many of them will succeed. And so, you know, just to say, a little bit far away from the personal side, on the entrepreneurial side, I've never seen a richer environment for people creating new ideas.
And that's powerful. And I would also say a lot of those, like those robotics companies, if it wasn't for like the Arduino, they wouldn't be able to prototype, raise that money, you know, hey, we're going to make a hamburger flipping machine. You need those tools. They're all building blocks that really kind of come back to where it kind of started from 10, 15 years ago.
I'm all focused on software right now. And I think the open source software movement is still just beginning. I mean, you know, right now the tools, you know, whether it's GitHub or, you know, or Discord, the tools for community creation and curating and collaboration have never been better. So, you know, I think that's going to be with us for decades.
Yeah. You know, I just to not be a killjoy here in a sense, but you know, I still think we have these huge impediments. You know, like if you look like what school systems did during COVID-19, you know, yes, they used Zoom, but they required kids to sit in their seat with you know, and listen to someone talk at them far too much. They didn't actually use computing very effectively. They didn't think of themselves as connecting kids to sources of learning. You know, there's still a really difficult challenge to introduce more people to it. Just take that core idea that Carl said, that they can have ideas and those ideas can be developed into something real and meaningful and shared and you know, made into, you know, some kind of thing. You know, I still feel like more people, it's possible to imagine more people having that experience over and over, just the way they have that experience in sports or playing music, that I think this is something that I hold out as a goal. And I don't know whether it'll come on the community side or the institutional side, but it needs to happen.
Yeah, no, Dale, I totally share your enthusiasm and passion for it happening. But I would also say, if you look at, you know, the last year and a half of the pandemic, I mean, what I think you saw was institutional failure.
Yes.
You know, writ large. And it was mainly in places that were some form of monopoly.
Yes.
You know, so if you look and you go schools, there's not a lot of competition in schools. And so these organizations, school boards, individual school, are not really agile organizations. I spent the first 3 months of the pandemic making PPE. I can't tell you how frustrated we were dealing with hospital administrators or government administrators. In the end, we did as someone described. We found doctors, nurses, first responders, and we shipped directly because we decided that the institutions were incapable of acting in a way that was responsive to the needs of the moment because they were built for another problem. And, you know, the hospital administrators I talked to, you know, they were used to making decisions to buy a new MRI machine over a 5-year time frame. They weren't used to like triage and getting things in there that would help people tomorrow. And the incentive structures along with this, that many of these things were, you know, kind of no risk. I had people not accepting our PPE because it wasn't FDA approved, hospital administrators.
Wow.
And, you know, nurses and doctors telling me, if I was using this PPE the way I'm using it now, a month ago, I would have been fired for malpractice. The things I'm doing now are so terrible. And they couldn't bridge that gap. And, you know, and so I look and I go, you know, we just need to understand that some of these institutions were doing exactly what they were built for. We shouldn't be very surprised that they weren't all that good at responding to this kind of crisis.
Right. And I
Yeah,
think that
yeah,
brings up
I
a
agree.
point, decentralization versus centralization. And I think the maker movement, the internet was designed to be decentralized. And I think, if anything, like you said, this crisis is kind of shown when people kind of come together. So I feel like that's the theme of the future, is this decentralized. I mean, the hottest thing in technology is this decentralized finance and crypto. But it's kind of interesting that you bring up, because I think that that's really the core of, when you say the maker movement, it wasn't a sole thing. I mean, Dale, you gave it a name, but it was a very broad, very distributed set of shared knowledge, tools, learning. And I think that's what it is. I think overall, we all sound really optimistic about the future, and, the future of humans, and humans making and innovating and creating, right? I mean, making and creating, they're hand in hand. They're one and the same. So, okay, we got a little different nomenclature, but I think the result is the future's so bright, we got to wear shades. I want to
Carl does.
thank
He's
you all
outside.
so much for taking the time. Really appreciate it, and just having a fantastic conversation. I know a lot of folks will really appreciate it, and I know they will. So really appreciate your experiences here and thoughts on it. And I've really enjoyed connecting with you all. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Absolutely.
Bye.